I have been reading a book by Alan Jacobs, The Pleasure of Reading in an Age of Distraction. Alan Jacobs was a teacher at a school that I went to, and so some of the people that I had classes with, I guess, my co-students, they had him as a teacher. I never had him as a teacher, but he's written this wonderful little book, which I picked up. I think it's just really beautiful cover and all of that. I highly recommend this book for any of you who have reading as a hobby, as a job, as a life goal, or maybe you want to. Really interesting and delightful things to say in this book. He has a lot of former students that contact him and say, you know, what should I be reading? What are the top books? Give me your best books, because he read books with students in class. I should say that he was an English teacher and is an English professor. So he would read books with students, Jane Austen, that sort of stuff. And then after school, they contact him and say, oh, you know, give me more. What else should I be reading? And he basically doesn't give people anything. He doesn't give out book recommendations, top 10, top 100 lists, anything like that. What he says to these people is he says, read at whim. Whim is his word, and he talks about it kind of like a law or a principle that really reading works best when it's driven by one's whim. And if you don't speak English well enough, whim is just more your fancy, your where the wind's blowing, kind of what's happening in you, and you sort of decide at whim. You choose things at whim. It's not really thought out way of acting. And he says that's a really important principle to follow when you're choosing books, because he says that a book should ultimately be pleasurable to you. They should give you delight, give you joy, and if you concentrate on these sort of book lists, these sort of top books, recommendations, this is what you should read, this is what you ought to read, then you might be slugging through things that really don't help you, don't give you what you're looking for in a book, and you might miss the wonderful privilege of reading for pleasure. Well, I kind of disagree. Hey everybody, welcome to the Sanctus Forum. I am Michael Stewart Robb, better known as Mike, and here on the Sanctus Forum, sponsored by the Sanctus Institute, we talk about books and everyday spirituality. And if that's your thing, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel and come back, check out the channel's page, and see what other sorts of videos might be of interest to you. I thought maybe a number of videos would be possible about this lovely little book by Alan Jacobs, and I don't mean to start off with contradicting him, but I think that there is something here that's rather important. In a previous video, I talked about there being different kinds of books and different ways to approach these books, and Alan Jacobs is an English professor, so he's largely reading fiction books with his students, poetry. He's maybe some literary nonfiction, things like that. And in that world, it really does matter what is pleasurable, what is delightful, what gives you joy, and those are, in a sense, what you ought to be going after, seeking out. And that's really the crucial question there, is what are you after when you are picking up a book? Actually, I should read what he has to say about this, because I want to make sure that you know that I'm not exaggerating what he has to say. Forget for a moment how books should be read. Why should they be read? The first reason, the first sequentially in the story that follows, but also the first in order of importance, is that reading books can be intensely pleasurable. Now, then he goes on, has a bunch of more words about that and about the importance of pleasure and joy and why we need that in our life. And I don't want to argue with that, but he does put this priority on pleasure. And I think that's where the history of reading and the history of books doesn't quite bear up to that. Here's an example. Here are my copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And these are kind of pleasurable books, but the way that they were used in the centuries that followed was as educational tools for Greek society. And the Greeks basically would try to imitate books like this, poets like this, and that was their rudimentary educational system. It was a form of spiritual formation, a word that we use on this channel, I use on this channel. And actually, most books that we've had in history have been some form of that. They have been for information, for education, for living a better life and all that. It hasn't been very often that we've just had books that were written for the pleasure and delight of their audience. Now, I mean, there are, and I'm not gonna argue with that, and a lot of books will combine them all, and so you'll have books like this that have very wonderful speeches and poetry in them, but in a sense that's more of a side feature or an additional aspect of what they are. So, as I say here, I think he's wrong about this. I think he's wrong about this. I think he's kind of pushing back against a book like this, How to Read by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Duren, which is a bit of a reading classic since 1940, I think, is when this was read. And he mainly has in mind that reading is important for our education, and therefore he lists out and is very happy to list out books that are important for our education, and he kind of dismisses this sort of pleasurable reading thing, and so Alan Jacobs is kind of pushing back against that, and I guess that's important, but I think he just pushes too far. And one of his mentors is C.S. Lewis, also a person to read on reading, and Lewis has this idea that books should be we should follow our whims, we should follow what delights us, and that's very, very important for our souls and for our minds. Okay, well, I agree with that, and here's what I want to say about that. You should read things for pleasure, for delight. I think you should always have something that you read for that purpose. Now, currently for me, it is Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. That's what I've chosen. I'm not a terribly fast reader when it comes to things like this, so I've been reading it for at least 2 months already, but I am almost done. I think I was supposed to read this in high school, and if I remember correctly now, I only read the first 6 chapters, and I don't know how I passed the test, but I did that somehow. Maybe I read Cliff Notes or something, but I don't recall the story at all. I think whim is very important for these kinds of books. I think that one thing that you want to avoid is stocking up on books that you're going to read for your pleasure, for delight, for beauty. I think that when it's time for a new book, you should just look at what's out there and buy that. I actually don't really know what I'm going to read after I finish this. I have some ideas, but I won't decide, I won't buy the book until this is done, because I have had too many occasions when I bought a book because, oh yeah, I definitely want to read this, but I didn't have time to read it then. And so therefore it went onto my shelf. And then by the time that I was done with the current book that I was reading, I didn't really want to read it anymore, at least not as much. And so that's, I think, where whim can be extremely important to keep us reading, to just sort of see where those winds in our soul are blowing at the time when we finish a particular book. What I do is I keep a list, as you know, as I've talked about. Just use that urge when you see that sort of book, like, oh, I might like to read that one day. Don't buy it. Just put it on a list, and that way you'll remember it. And maybe next week you won't want to read it anymore, and that's okay too. But you haven't forgot it. It's still there, and that's how you can keep reading things and keep enjoying the books that you currently are reading. Hey, if you want to know more about the Sanctus Institute, you can check out our website, sanctus.institute, and sign up for our almost monthly newsletter at sanctus.institute. And I will see you then next week. Okay? Bye.